Hello, it's me, Amanda, licensed mental health therapist and narcissistic abuse treatment clinician, certified. Today, I would like to, in honor of June, which is Trauma Awareness Month, I'd like to speak on something that is under-recognized, and that is complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Let's talk about what it is. What's the difference between CPTSD and PTSD? And how can we do better and resolve this by knowing this information? Let's see. Now, this matters to me a lot because when I went to graduate school, we didn't learn about CPTSD. And when I did my internship and I started work, I still didn't know about CPTSD. I knew about post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety. I knew about other mood disorders, and I knew about personality disorders. Substance abuse disorders, all of these things can have some differential diagnosis elements to it, depending on how the behavior is presenting. So this is really important to me because I feel that I was impeded from being educated adequately to give some of my clients the correct diagnosis. To this day, CPTSD is not recognized in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. It is not in the DSM-5 text revision. And that was about 4 years ago. This is June 2026 right now. So it is in the ICD-11, which is worldwide known and used in the medical field. But in the mental health field, it did not get added to the DSM-5 because it was said that there was not enough empirical evidence to support that it existed. And then when the text revision occurred, it was said that it was better accounted for as just PTSD or borderline personality disorder. So now there are some professionals speaking about the difference between CPTSD and borderline personality disorder. And that's a very interesting thing to say because borderline personality disorder is a cluster B personality disorder, and it's a personality disorder. And while the symptoms can be managed and a lot of improvement can be made, personality disorders are not curable. They're manageable, they're not curable. Now, PTSD and CPTSD they are curable. You can recover, you can heal. You can get rid of your symptoms. You really can. But you can't get rid of your borderline symptoms. So sit with that for just a moment, that complex post-traumatic stress disorder is so impactful that clinical people think that it is a borderline personality disorder, something that is so chronic and so pervasive and so core and so disruptive that it's just the way that the personality is and everything is going to stem from it and it cannot be resolved. That is how intense and severe these traumatic events are when a person does get CPTSD. So intense and severe that it makes a person present as though they have a personality disorder when they don't. All right, so what is post-traumatic stress disorder and complex post-traumatic stress disorder? Well, both of these come from trauma. The complex post-traumatic stress disorder is more relational, more emotional, more psychological. It's chronic and pervasive. Okay, and so in short, what is CPTSD? It is PTSD plus these goodies over here. Post-traumatic stress disorder typically is one event, and these symptoms occur at least 1 month after the event happens. And yes, there can be delayed onset. So the symptoms must be presenting at least a month after and not before. So this is going to be exposure to death, the threat of death, physical harm, sexual violence, that sort of thing. And it's going to include one or more symptoms of each of these subsets of symptoms. So we're going to have intrusive memories. That could be dreams. It could be just rumination and the thoughts popping into your head involuntarily and compulsively. We're going to have avoidance. That can be not wanting to talk about it, not wanting to think about it, trying to use distraction, even from the emotions. And it can also be avoidance of reminders such as people and places, conversations, smells even, triggers associated. Third set here, negative changes in mood and thinking. And this is focused on the event. So negative changes in thinking or mood, what that means is that there can be some shame, sadness, guilt. There can be some self-blame. There can be some depression and anxiety. And then the fourth subset here, physical and emotional arousal is heightened. So this is because of the 4 F's, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. So the amygdala is overactive. The sympathetic nervous system is overactive and can't calm down and stay calm because safety was threatened, and now the brain is looking for safety to protect you. This is about what happened. This is more temporary. Now here, if you have complex post-traumatic stress disorder, you're going to have all of this and this. Now this is often relational. It's often psychological and emotional. So PTSD doesn't acknowledge the psychological and emotional harm, which is also interesting because we have plenty of information now to know that there is a lot of brain damage and a lot of nervous system damage, even with psychological and emotional trauma, even emotional neglect, especially in a child. Okay, so here's some additional. We have 1, 2, 3, and I put 5, 6, 7 because we're going to have these 4 plus these additional 3. That equals 7 symptoms here. So we're going to also have disrupted sense of self, and that's going to be about your identity. Okay, that's going to be a negative self-concept. This is the establishment of that inner critic, and always feeling like you are just inherently bad, a problem, not worthy of love. That's that toxic shame. And it's kind of similar to negative changes in thinking or mood. It's kind of similar to that. But there is a difference because this is more focused on the event in PTSD. And this one here is more focused on who you are, who you believe you are. This affects your identity and your beliefs about you and yourself and who you are. All right. So now we've got emotional, affect, and dysregulation. This is very severe and it's foundational. Rather than being responsive here, like in physical and emotional arousal being heightened. Okay, we're gonna kind of connect that over there because they're similar, but they're different. This one is more so when triggered. And then this one here is more so constantly, a constant state of this. So you can see when we're thinking clinically about differential diagnoses or just trying to figure out if you're a survivor and a victim and a survivor here, trying to figure out what happened, what is going on inside of my brain, how do I fix this? And for us clinicians, we've got to really consider these differential diagnoses and think, is this a personality disorder or is this a cause of trauma? And this can be very difficult to see because it does last so long. And a lot of times this is developed in childhood. This also includes disturbance in relationships. Let's talk about this. This is very interesting. Why do we have such a disturbance in relationships and what does this all mean? So this is going to affect emotional intimacy, and a lot of that can be because if a person is in a prolonged unhealthy relationship where they grow up where they never knew what a healthy relationship was, a lot of times vulnerabilities get used against people and there's a lot of exploitation. So that creates a lot of distrust and a lot of fear of sharing emotional vulnerabilities. And when you don't share your emotional vulnerabilities, you don't emotionally connect. You never get that safety and feeling of full acceptance. So it really inhibits relationships by not making emotional intimacy flow naturally, like it should, like it naturally would. There's this internal feeling of distrust. You're not sure what people's motives are. Too many emotional outbursts or withdrawals, that can affect relationships too. Going back to here, emotional affect and dysregulation. People with CPTSD often do have a hard time in their relationships because their emotions are difficult for their friends or their partners to deal with, and they may even withdraw here, so isolate themselves. And it can look kind of like a silent treatment, or it's more like stonewalling because there's a higher chance of getting overwhelmed here. Okay, there's also trauma reenactment and repetition compulsion in complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and both of these things are not good for relationships. This would be trauma reenactment. A lot of people might say, my picker is broken. I just can't seem to pick a good person. I always pick someone who is abusive and mean, or always has a drinking problem or a drug problem, and they just seem to be stuck on picking the same kind of person all the time. And then repetition compulsion has to do with, I kind of think of it like when little kids copy what they've seen, and they're playing like they're going shopping, or they're playing like they're cooking, and it's kind of like it's replaying in an adult's behavior, or a child can have CPTSD. It's being compulsively repeated, the behaviors that they've observed or reactions to them, the hyperarousal. Now, because CPTSD is often relational, it frequently includes betrayal trauma as another type of trauma. This is not a diagnosis, but it's more of a recognition of a concept and a real experience that has unique damage in the brain and the nervous system. And then also traumatic cognitive dissonance, because it breaks down a person's beliefs about who they think they can trust and what they think is real and true. And also disenfranchised grief, which is grief at losses that are not typical losses like death. Like, other people understand death as a loss, but people have a hard time understanding if you lose people who are still alive, because they are doing all this stuff to you. And you have to separate from that in order to be okay. Okay, so zooming out here, taking a look at these differences here, regular PTSD is going to be more about your body's safety, and complex post-traumatic stress disorder can absolutely include physical safety. It also includes the psychological and the emotional safety and the relational safety, because relationships in CPTSD often get used in ways that are exploitative and traumatic, obviously, because we have a trauma disorder here that's negatively impacting someone's quality of life and ability to function in more than one realm. Okay, and remember, let's review some of these differences here. This one is more temporary, PTSD. CPTSD is going to be more prolonged and more chronic, more foundational. That means that, like a house's foundation, everything about that person is built up based on this emotional affect and dysregulation. So it's going to be seen across the board. And then PTSD has more focus on what happened, the event, and CPTSD is more focused on how it affects your concept of who you are as a person, your inherent value. So here's a bit from Complex PTSD, From Surviving to Thriving by Pete Walker. This is the definition provided in this book of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. CPTSD is a more severe form of post-traumatic stress disorder. It is delineated from its better-known trauma symptoms by 5 of its most common and troublesome features: emotional flashbacks, toxic shame, self-abandonment, a vicious inner critic, and social anxiety. And just to jump back in there, regarding the self-abandonment, notice how one of the 4 F's is fawning. Fawning is not as well known as freeze, fight, and flight. But fawning is when you give in and you submit to the abuser in order to minimize or avoid harm. And so what happens is this repeatedly happens over and over and over, and this is also attached to the trauma reenactment and fawning, even when in real life you're safe and you don't have to fawn to be safe. And this ends up showing up in adulthood as people pleasing. So then that's the self-abandonment. Just constantly focusing on how to please other people so much that you don't take care of yourself. And you're always saying yes, 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 yes to everybody. And you don't say yes to yourself adequately. And you don't look out for your well-being. You put other people's well-being before your own to a point where it harms you. And you might notice that you feel some resentment to other people, like that you give and give and give in relationships, but other people don't give as much as you do. And if that's the case, maybe you're not hanging out with nice people. Maybe you're stuck in the fawn response and you're people pleasing because you've got complex PTSD. Possibly. Worth thinking about. Let's read on, shall we? This is on page 3. It includes emotional flashbacks, are perhaps the most noticeable and characteristic feature of CPTSD. Survivors of traumatizing abandonment are extremely susceptible to painful emotional flashbacks, which, unlike PTSD, do not typically have a visual component. Emotional flashbacks are sudden and often prolonged regressions to the overwhelming feeling states of being an abused, abandoned child. These feeling states can include overwhelming fear, shame, alienation, rage, grief, and depression. They also include unnecessary triggering of our fight-flight instincts. It's important to state here that the emotional flashbacks, like most things in life, are not all or none. Flashbacks can range in intensity from subtle to horrific. They can also vary in duration, ranging from moments to weeks on end. So emotional flashbacks are very characteristic of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Yes, they can also happen in regular PTSD as well. So what kind of events lead people to getting CPTSD compared to PTSD? Got a list for you. These include things like human trafficking of whatever kind. And remember, this includes relational and prolonged, repeated, inescapable events where the individual feels trapped, cannot escape, cannot get out. So human trafficking, early childhood abuse, and that could be any type of abuse: sexual, physical, emotional, psychological, relational. It can even include neglect. And I thought that was very interesting that Pete Walker was citing that even emotional neglect is enough to have a child grow up and establish CPTSD. So no one has to actively abuse a child if they are emotionally neglected and not mirrored and attuned to adequately. Then they can get a prolonged trauma disorder. And there's also good enough parenting, which means that you only have to get it right 30% of the time. So think about that. A kid growing up chronically where a parent does not attune and mirror and emotionally repair when there are ruptures, not even 30% of the time. Sit with that. Okay, this also includes domestic violence and dysfunctional family systems. So think about that too. A lot of this can be childhood, it's not always, but it can be childhood trauma. And a child can't move out, they can't divorce their parents, and when their siblings are abusing them, because a lot of times in dysfunctional and toxic families, siblings have to abuse one another in order to avoid being the target. And you can't divorce your siblings. You can't move out from them. You're trapped. When you are a child, you're trapped. Other ways that this kind of domestic violence can come into play is when somebody marries an abusive person or they marry into an abusive, toxic family system. Because it's not so simple to simply just break up that relationship. There's emotions, investment, cognitive dissonance, because usually abusive people don't disclose that prior to the wedding. So You can deal with a lot of that cognitive dissonance, which is also a sticking point, and it mentally traps people, kids involved, financials, home, okay? And it can also include domestic violence, even just witnessing. We all know by this point, it's well documented, that it is healthier for parents to divorce, even though that is an adverse childhood experience, than it is for them to continue to argue and fight and have that tension in the house the whole time that children are growing up while their brain is developing under that hyperarousal. So, even if the child is not directly being abused, just being around it all the time, that is trauma, and that can establish CPTSD. Okay, we also have like prisoners of war, torture, captivity. That's very long and pervasive, and a lot of the times there is a lot of brainwashing and psychological abuse incurred in that. Slavery, forced prostitution, systemic and organized violence, some stuff like news-making events, that kind of stuff. So what's happening in the body when a person gets complex post-traumatic stress disorder? There's a profound physical and chemical alteration, multiple alterations in the brain. The amygdala is overactive. That's the arousal alarm. And that whole nervous system includes the sympathetic nervous system. And it's hyper-aroused and cannot just choose to calm down. It's involuntary. It's compulsive. It's not a choice. It's not wanted. It's not deliberate. It's involuntary and it's unwanted. The prefrontal cortex, that's responsible for logical thinking, that functioning goes down. It's also the hippocampus functioning goes down too, which is responsible for storing memories. And that's why a lot of the times a person can have implicit memories. They can't remember what happened, but their body remembers how they felt. There's a shrunken hippocampus, that's regarding memory. So that also is why a lot of the times children can't retell what happened. There are hormonal imbalances, such as HPA axis burnout, and the cortisol and the adrenaline is up significantly to a point where this ends up causing physical harm. So a person cannot touch another person. It can be all emotional neglect or emotional, psychological, and relational abuse, and producing CPTSD. And the hormones are escalated so chronically that the body can establish autoimmune diseases and a lot of things like stomach aches, migraine problems, chronic sleep disturbances. If there is a physical diagnosis that's not getting better with normal treatment, or the causation just is a mystery, you might want to see a mental health therapist and start discussing your relationships and history and see what can be found out through there. Because a lot of the times once those emotions get expressed and felt and honored, then healing can begin. All right. Also, chronic fatigue, severe physical fatigue, and severe anxiety, severe psychological anxiety. So you can see too how just a lack of sleep is not good for your health. It makes you more prone to getting sick. And when you are sick, it makes those sicknesses worse and makes them last longer. Okay. You can also have heart racing, shallow breathing, muscle tension, gastrointestinal issues, physical wear and tear, chronic increase of stress hormones. There's more allostatic load, more inflammation, higher risk of cardiovascular and immune diseases. Okay, now let's talk about how to heal. This is pretty terrible, but don't worry more than what is helpful. Okay, how to heal. Now, Pete Walker talks about managing emotional flashbacks by recognizing them and using grounding techniques. He talks about shrinking the inner critic, basically by challenging those thoughts and reaffirming yourself and grounding in reality with new beliefs. It's kind of like writing your own narrative instead of letting your events and the way that you were treated define you. It's really important to practice self-reparenting if this was in childhood, having empathy and compassion and support for yourself, kind of talking to yourself the way you would if you had a child. You're talking to your inner child. And then grieve. Feel the anger, process it, express it. This is extremely important because if feelings don't get metabolized and processed and felt, then they still come out. It's like, was that the fault within our stars? Pain demands to be felt. It is very true. You can't hide them. And a lot of times that is one of the reasons why, say, in a situation like family scapegoating abuse, that's why a family picks a scapegoat, is because they have all of this tension and these emotions, and they're pouring it into somebody else as a way of feeling relief, but they're not processing, so there's no healing. So you don't want to do that, and you don't want to fall into that. And a way to prevent that can be to process your emotions. And that prevents a lot of other things too. Okay? Work through the 4 F's. Fight, flight, freeze, fawn. 4. So identify what state is hyper-aroused for you and how that shows up. And then actively work to remind yourself that you're safe. Here's some tips from me, just as a clinician. Create a toolbox that has 2 bits to it: coping strategies and self-care strategies. Because when you've got trauma and complex trauma, it is constantly eating away at you. So you've got to take care of you. And what this also does, next tip from me, get psychoeducation about what trauma and complex trauma is, and about whatever the form of trauma and abuse you endured was. Get education on that specific phenomenon and dynamic, and figure out what normal responses are to that kind of trauma, because that will validate you. And there's often a lot of manipulation and betrayal. So when those emotions come back up and you start rehashing the past, you want to have your toolbox ready to help you. Okay? Use intentional parasympathetic nervous system activation. So you will find this a lot if you're doing EMDR therapy. Also listening to music, yoga, movement, outdoors. Pete Walker also talked about stretching, like just doing stretches helps to get the tension out of your muscles. Some somatic work there. Okay, let's see. Process, purge, and challenge. Yeah. Journal, talk to a friend or a therapist, someone who's safe, who you trust, who gets it, at least gets it enough to hold space for your feelings. Expose yourself to safe opportunities to believe something better. So sometimes people really isolate themselves because they're afraid to get hurt again. But you do need to have some level of exposure to attempting to have a healthy relationship so that there's hope that it can happen. And then when you do get success in that, it can reinforce the belief that it's possible, and it is possible. Make lifestyle changes that boost safety. Avoid harmful people. That can include boundaries and ending contact or limiting contact with people who cause harm. Avoid unsafe places. So, that might mean for some people they have to move. Some people have to change their jobs. Some people have to change their church. Build new support systems. Yep, that's my last one. Build a trusty support system and community. So if you need to find a new church or a new group, or, a lot of times there are those online communities, and that can be safer because you can have some distance and you can protect your identity, and it's kind of like baby steps to having a more intimate relationship. So that is a good idea for CPTSD. Anyway, if I've got an ending note for you, it's that there is hope that this can heal. And I think it's really important that those of us who are clinicians, that we know that complex post-traumatic stress disorder is a real condition, even though it's not acknowledged in the DSM. It is acknowledged in the ICD-11, and it got mentioned in the ICD-11 back in 2018 And the last update to the DSM was 2022. So it's been 4 years since it's been recognized, and we haven't caught up to that. But it is well known, and it is for real. And if you're a clinician, what you need to know is that these clients who have complex trauma are going to need more gentleness and more time. And when I started, the only therapeutic approach that I knew was trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. And so it was just talking about it, doing a narrative. There was psychoeducation and like coping strategy building, but it was more straight to the point. And what I found was that there are a lot of people who cannot handle that because the emotional weight is too heavy. And remember, it's very identity focused. So visiting that gets a person feeling that they are bad. And so you have to take the time. It's going to take as long as it takes, and it's going to take longer than regular PTSD to work through all those things. And this is important. It would be great to have it in the DSM and have it as a proper diagnosis, because that also affects billing. And more sessions are necessary when you know you're dealing with CPTSD over PTSD. I also want to make a point to say we are not comparing these for the sake of saying that one is heavier or lighter than the other. I think trauma is trauma, and if you have trauma, it's good to heal it. Some people think their trauma is not worth recognizing because it wasn't bad enough. You don't need to compare trauma. If you have trauma, you have trauma, and you're worth healing. So I hope that helps you grow and be the person you want to be, and feel confident that healing is absolutely possible. Catch you later. Bye.